All right, let's get started. Thanks everyone for joining me today. It's really an honor and a privilege to be able to speak with everyone to really dig in a little bit more about clinical trials. For those of you who don't know who I am or haven't seen our website, my name is Jordan Dubow. I'm the Chief Medical Officer at Beyond Celiac. Been working with this great team now for almost a year. I'm a neurologist by training and actually practiced for a little bit and have been developing drugs for the last 15 years. I've had the privilege of working on a lot of drugs for neurology, getting them approved. About 3 years ago, my son was diagnosed with celiac disease. And so since that time, it's been really my passion to help this community and help really get a treatment approved for celiac disease. And that's really why, we're talking today. To get drugs approved, do we need clinical trials and clinical research? So we wanted to talk some generals about, what is clinical trials? Why should you participate in a clinical trial? And kind of how a drug even goes through that process. Before we start, I want to give a special thanks to our sponsor, the Ravitz Family Foundation. So really, to start with, what is a clinical trial, right? And so to get a drug approved, we need to go through a clinical trial process and really test how well a drug could work. Alternatively, it also tests how safe a drug can be, right? So a drug needs to work and it needs to be safe. We also look at different doses. How do we actually know when you take a dose of a medicine, what actually is the right dose to take? And sometimes we use more than one drug in combination, and a trial can also do that. And really what these trials try to do is they try to look at the effect of a drug on a symptom or some, one way of functioning, looking at quality of life measure. You can go to the next slide, please. And so when we think about clinical research, it needs to be differentiated from medical care, right? So medical care is an individual when you go and see your doctor. And it's really what's best for you, what's best for the patient. It's the old adage, do no harm. It's very flexible. You give care for those who request it. On the other side is clinical research. So clinical research is stringent. It's driven by a protocol, right? So everything has to happen a certain way that's laid out in a very large 100-page protocol. There has to be reasonable benefit risk, right? And so if you're testing a drug, there has to be some benefit and the risk has to be reasonable. And we'll get a little more into informed consent. If you go into a clinical trial, you have to sign a document informing you of potential risks and your rights as a study participant. And it's very rigid, right? You can't kind of just your doctor can't just do whatever they want. They need to follow the approach of what's in the clinical protocol. And there's very strict inclusion and exclusion criteria. And so as I think many of you know, not everyone can qualify for certain clinical trials. It may be an age restriction. It may be a certain type of, if you're having symptoms, you're not having symptoms. So again, clinical research is very strict, protocol driven. It's a lot different from medical care. Go to the next one. So for those people who want to participate in research, generally what we like is patients who are stable. Now, every clinical trial we do for a disease, there is a disease you're testing. But outside of that, it's, in clinical trials, people need to be generally healthy. They need to have kind of psychologically strong, be willing to participate in multiple visits, do a lot of assessments. It's very rigorous. And also it's good to have social support. Oftentimes it's transportation going to and from a site, things like that. It's good to have that. And also be really motivated. So the best thing when we start a clinical trial is we're going to get data. The worst thing for a clinical trial is if someone doesn't complete the clinical trial or too many people don't complete the clinical trial, it makes that data hard to interpret. And so that's why it's really demanding. Like we ask a lot. We need everyone to participate in research in order for them to be a treatment, but it's really demanding and it's not easy. So I mentioned informed consent. So if anyone's going to go into a clinical trial, you have to sign what's called an informed consent form. And this is where you learn as much as you can about the clinical trial before agreeing to go through what the process is. You may be on a drug, you may be on placebo, could be a 6-week, 12-week, 24, 48-week trial. You need to learn about the purpose. What's the purpose of this research? What is that drug trying to do? Again, what are the risks and what are the benefits? And sometimes for a later phase study, which we'll get into, we may know a lot about the risks. But for really early phase studies, we may only know about the risks from animals. And we don't really know if what happens in an animal is going to happen to a human. If there are alternative treatments, it has to also say, listen, you could try X, Y, or Z instead of going in this trial. Speaks to confidentiality, right? Just like when you see your doctor, everything is private, everything is confidential. If something were to happen to you to a study, it tells you that you would get the appropriate treatment. right? So maybe you get a side effect, you need to go see a doctor, see a specialist, get a test. That should be covered under that, and you will have access to that. And also, obviously, who you can contact for questions. The most important thing is it's voluntary, right? So once you sign an informed consent form and agree to go in a clinical trial, at any point in time, you can withdraw that consent and stop the trial. As I said, I think it's important that we get as much data as possible, but for any reason, if you don't want to continue, it is your right to withdraw that consent based on the informed consent form. We can go to the next one. And so how do we ensure these trials are done well? They're done safe and that people are protected. And that's where we have something called an institutional review board. So every clinical protocol, any material really related to this trial, a study website, materials that you kind of get a handout, all of that goes through an institutional review board. And these are independent, separate from the pharmaceutical company, not FDA. These are independent, really experts, right? And oftentimes they're either hospital or private, and there are physicians, nurses, statisticians. Oftentimes they're ethicists on there as well to make sure that someone's overseeing the conduct of the study and to make sure ethics are followed and everyone's right and safety is followed. So when you go into a clinical trial, you sign an informed consent form, all of that has already been reviewed and approved by an IRB. So there is someone kind of overseeing, blessing the study to know that, okay, we've reviewed this, we think it is safe to conduct that study. And that's in addition to, an FDA or a regulatory agent. It's an independent review board that says it's okay to conduct this study. We can go to the next one. So why should you not participate, right? And so really research participation is really to advance the science and help others with the same disease. Now, granted, it could help the individual, but it's really doing it for the good of the community. And the hope is that if a drug works, you can get benefit and you can get access. Because it's possible that the trial may not benefit you as an individual, right? You may get the placebo. If you're in a short study, you may not get access to the active drug. But again, it can help others. Also can give you access to investigational drugs, right? So we know for certain conditions and oncology and cancer where sometimes there isn't a lot of options, getting in a clinical trial can give you, hey, listen, the current treatment isn't good enough. Maybe there's an experimental treatment that could help. It does give you free medical care, and sometimes that could be important. And it's also possible that travel and time may be compensated, but the compensation is still small. You can't be overly compensated. You can't be coerced to participate in research. Why should you participate, right? Again, it's not for everyone. If you can't commit to starting, finishing the trial, going to every visit, then, it may not be right for you at this point in time. If you don't think you have the time or you're not willing to fill out the assessments, because, these trials have a lot of endpoints and a lot of scales and a lot of things that you have to do. And obviously here, sometimes there's, endoscopy and sometimes there's a gluten challenge. And so you have to be willing to do all that. And you may not be, which is totally fine. So research participation might not be right for you. And there could sometimes be other medical issues or other things going on in your life that just make it hard at this time to participate in research. So it's not for everybody. So when we look at how do we get a drug approved, there's a lot of different stages, right? We always focus on the end, FDA approval, and that's clearly the best part when we get access to a drug. But it starts oftentimes a decade before. And so there's really different phases of development that any drug has to go to. And even if you've participated in a study, it's gone through this. So we start with kind of what we call preclinical studies. And these are not in humans, these are in animals. We'll go into a little more detail on that in a minute, but it's kind of looking at could this drug work in a human and is it safe? You then have to do a bunch of tests, compile them in multiple documents. You submit them. For the FDA, we'll talk about the US here. You do what's called an IND. It's really an investigational new drug application. You submit that to FDA. They have to go through everything, and they have to ensure that based on what they've seen, you've done everything you need to do to move to the next step. They think it's safe, let's go to the next step. Because if they don't, they won't let you go into humans. So once you clear that, and that still takes, could take a couple of years, you then go into humans, right? And that's where we start with kind of the phase 1, which is the early phase clinical trial, which we'll go into a little bit more. Was you first time ever going in humans. And then after that, if you pass that part, you then go into kind of phase 2 studies where you usually look at more people, longer period of time, really starting to see if the drug works, what's the right dose. And if you pass that, you then go to kind of phase 3. These are the large studies, the last stage of development. And for most drugs, you need 2 of those studies to be positive to then try to get approval. So after you've gone through everything, if you get 2 positive studies, you then have to, again, compile all your data. You put it all together, all your safety data, all that animal data, other data that you do. You have to compile that, which could take 6 months, a lot of effort, a lot of work. Then you file that application to FDA. And in most cases, for not very rare diseases, it's still another 12 months that the FDA has to review the drug. They can ask you questions and ultimately decide on the drug. And so that's how this process is, unfortunately, not quick, but it has to be somewhat rigorous like this to ensure a drug's safe, to ensure you get the right dose, and to really demonstrate that a drug is effective. Now we can go into kind of some of these in a little more detail. Go to the next slide, please. And so before that, just this is to tell you, as I think everyone knows, it's expensive, right? I mean, drug development is expensive. As you go up kind of from preclinical to phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3, these studies can cost, hundreds of millions of dollars. And unfortunately, the probability of success for any new drug is not high, is low. And there's a table on the right that just, again, this is relatively new data, looking at the overall probability of success of a drug. Again, as a neurologist, I've done a lot of central nervous system, maybe a 15% chance, autoimmune inflammation where celiac fits. It's about a 15% chance, 1 in 8, give or take, of any drug from the beginning will get across the finish line. And that's why we need 8 shots on goal, 16 shots on goal, 24 shots on goal to try to get 1, 2, or 3 drugs for celiac disease to help us. Go to the next one. And so, as we said, before we get into humans, we need to do a lot of work, right? And so we do what's called toxicology work, which is really testing the drug to ensure it's safe. And, whether right or wrong, we do these in usually rodents. You have to do it kind of in a rodent, a rat, a mouse. And sometimes you also have to do it in a non-rat or mouse, which sometimes could be a guinea pig. Sometimes, usually it's a monkey or a non-human primate. So you have to run a standard battery of these types of tests. And if your clinical trial is going to be 4 weeks in duration, you have to test it for 4 weeks in an animal. Once your clinical trial is going to be 52 weeks or longer, then you have to do longer and longer, 6 and 9 months of testing in animals to ensure it's safe before going into humans. Aside from that, you also have to look at cardiac function, the effect on the heart. You look at neurology functions. There's different batteries that you do for attention, memory, those types of things. And also from genetic to make sure this potentially can't, harm your DNA, to mutate, to cause cancer, those types of things. So you have to do a lot of those things from a safety standpoint prior going into humans. And on the right, it's hard to see. It's just to illustrate that you also test the drug to see if it's efficacious in models. And those are, again, usually in a rat, a mouse, sometimes a monkey. And, one of the challenges with celiac disease is that we don't have the best models, right? Because with the autoimmune, it's hard to come up with the best model to predict what's going to happen in humans, but we do have good models, and our friends at U of Chicago have a relatively new model, and there's lots of different models that you can do depending on kind of how your drug works. But the bottom line is you have to do that. You have to kind of get a general sense of, we've tested this drug, it's safe, doesn't cause harm in these animals, and it also looks like it was effective in these animals. And so you do that first, which again takes a couple years, compile that, summarize it, submit that to FDA. It's part of your investigational new drug application. And then you wait, and then hopefully they say, yes, you can go into humans to now really start seeing, is this drug safe? Is it effective? We can go to the next one, please. So phase 1 of development. So this is really exciting for companies generally, because it's like they've spent years and years and years getting through, the hard part, making sure the drug is safe to get into humans. And then now we're finally testing it in people, right? This is the start of getting a drug approved where we can help people. And there's really 2 ways you can do this kind of in your first in human study. You can do it in what we call healthy volunteers. And so the vast majority of drugs first go into what we call healthy volunteers. They're generally 18 to 55-year-olds who are healthy, have no issues, and they're just volunteers who go into these trials and agree to take drugs, be the first person ever to take them, to really see if they're safe, and also to look at blood levels of the drug, to make sure the drug's actually kind of getting into your body in the way that we thought it was going to be. And we first have to give people just 1 dose. You just start with 1 dose, very, very low, go higher, higher, higher. After you pass that, we then test it in multiple doses, generally 7 to 14 days if you're taking like a medicine once a day. And so that part generally is about 8 patients, 8 people in each of those groups. So you could be maybe in 56 to 100 people only are testing your drug first. On the flip side, something that we're seeing a lot in celiac disease, oftentimes we can go directly into humans and go right into the population we want to study, right? We don't want to go into healthy volunteers. We want to go into patients because that's ultimately who we're going to be studying. And now the FDA and other regulatory agencies are more open to this. It wasn't as much before, with the exception of things like cancer treatments. But now we're actually moving into patients sooner because you can just learn more. And so that's why a lot of the celiac disease trials that you see, they go right from animals directly into patients with celiac disease. And it still follows a similar concept to the healthy volunteers. You first just do one dose, low dose to high dose, and then you give multiple doses. But why people are now going directly to this is you can also give kind of the gluten challenge, which we know, isn't great for patients, but it's a way of early testing. Could this drug have an effect? And so you can now do that really early in development to try to early on really get a sign that we think this drug is doing what it's supposed to do. But most importantly, these early testings is for safety and looking at kind of blood levels of the drug. Go to the next one, please. And these are just examples, right? These are just publicly available studies. You may have known one of Takeda's drug, TAC-101, which is kind of an immune tolerance drug. And well on the right is the Immunic drug, which is an oral drug. And the one on the right was conducted in Australia. But it's a similar concept where they were first given to patients, not healthy volunteers, single doses, multiple doses. And then they kind of did that short gluten challenge to look at certain markers of disease activity, and could this drug help? And so these are just 2 examples of where companies have gone early on into patients to try to, really show early on, we think this drug is working. We think this drug has potential. We now can move it to the next stage of development, which is we call phase 2, where you do more patients for a longer duration. Go to the next one. So phase 2 studies in celiac disease, or even phase 2 studies in general. What has to be done here is you test multiple doses of a drug. When we take a medicine now, you kind of look at the bottle, your doctor says to take 10 milligrams once a day. To get to that point, you had to test multiple doses and kind of show what dose is effective, what dose is not effective, or there could be more than one dose that's effective, but one dose could have more side effects than the other one. So you only end up with a dose it was effective and it was safe. And these studies are longer, and these studies have more patients in them. Some could still be small, maybe 20 patients per group. Some could be really large for things like Alzheimer's disease. They could be hundreds of patients per group. Some can be short, 4, 8, 12 weeks. Others are long, could be 52 weeks. Some are even longer than that for certain conditions where you have to go out to 18 months or 2 years. And these are generally more rigorous scale studies, a little more demanding. The company is going to look at more things, right? More endpoints for celiac disease. It might look at GI symptoms, non-GI symptoms. They may do biopsies and look at histology, looking at more blood work. And then what we're seeing with celiac disease, again, there's kind of different populations that are being studied, right? So one could be looking at patients with celiac disease who really don't have any active symptoms, doing pretty well. If you did a scope, their histology looks normal. Then others actually look at those people who are still having symptoms, right? I'm on a gluten-free diet, doing everything I can. Cross-contamination is everywhere, still having symptoms and still actually having damage to the intestines. And you would look at this kind of before you got in the study to ensure kind of who goes in that study. And again, we still call these early phase studies learning studies, right? Because we still don't know who are the best people to study, what's the right duration to study, what's the right dose to study. And so that's why these are still learning studies. They take time. Sometimes you have to do more than one to do it. And, and on the right is just an illustration of an exciting drug. It's another drug from Takeda that's partnered with a European company called Zadera. It's a transglutaminase 2 inhibitor. They published, really interesting results in the New England Journal a couple of years ago. And it was a little bit of a longer study, a little bit of a bigger study with a gluten challenge. And so, that's where, again, phase 2 is very exciting. Kind of a lot of companies are sitting there right now. Still takes time, and it's still very rigorous. These studies are usually longer and demand more of you to participate. And so phase three of development, and unfortunately for celiac disease, we haven't had a lot going into phase three, but the hope is, and I should have started with this, is there's more drugs in the pipeline. There's more drugs kind of moving into the clinic in celiac disease than ever before. And so I think we're all really confident, optimistic, and hopeful that there will be more drugs that move into phase three of development. And these are the larger studies. So these for celiac disease likely are going to be hundreds of patients, right? You may have a couple hundred patients get drug, a couple hundred patients get placebo. It's possible there's a low dose of the drug, a high dose of the drug, and the placebo. And these studies, if the FDA wants these to be, 12-month studies, sometimes it could be 6 months and then, or 12 months. So these are longer studies, larger studies, could still be multiple doses of a drug. And the good news is a couple years ago, the FDA came out with a guidance document. And what this is to kind of help those people developing drugs. This is generally what we want you to do, right? And so the good thing, there was never anything for celiac disease. They at least came out with a guidance for celiac, recognizing the need for, okay, people are studying this. We need to give a roadmap for how drugs get approved. Right now the FDA wants people in phase three or to get, a drug approved to study, those people are still having symptoms despite being on a gluten-free diet and who still have damage to the intestine, if you look under the microscope after doing an endoscopy. And for these phase three studies right now, what the FDA wants, they want a drug to improve both the symptoms that you're having as well as the underlying intestinal damage. So, it's a high bar, but we think we can reach that bar. But that's why these studies are large, these studies are long, and these studies take a lot of time. And some of you may be familiar with the drug called Larazotide from a company called 9 Meters. This was kind of the closest to the finish line. This was a phase three study that unfortunately didn't show benefit and was stopped a couple years ago. But the good news is it made it to phase three. It showed we can do these phase three trials. But that's where we're moving, right? We have a bunch of exciting drugs that are getting to phase three. And generally, again, the FDA wants 2 studies to get a drug approved. And the reason they do this is because, they want it to be, if it's going to go to thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of people, they want to ensure that truly this drug is effective and truly this drug is safe. And so that's why they want you to replicate it, right? One study generally isn't enough. You have to replicate that twice so they can be really convinced that, yes, that drug really is doing something and that drug really is safe and has a good benefit to risk profile. The next one. And so what happens then, right? So let's just say we get to phase 2, phase 3, we have 2 positive studies and everyone's very happy. Your work isn't done, right? So usually you usually meet with the FDA, right? To kind of have a preliminary talk. You show them some of your data and hopefully they agree that everything you've done should allow for you to file your application, for them to at least review it and potentially approve it. And so you have to look at those efficacy studies showing it's effective. There's also a lot of other stuff that you have to do, right? Which you really don't talk about. You have to make sure that your drug doesn't interact with other drugs. So there's certain studies that you have to do in healthy volunteers to make sure of that. You have to make sure your drug doesn't have an effect on one's EKG, on your heart rhythm, right? So there's studies you have to do for that. So there's really, a lot of work you have to do. Additionally, kind of when you're moving from phase 2 to phase 3, that last stage, you actually have to submit a pediatric study plan, right? To show what is your intent? How are you going to study this in pediatric population? Because not as many drugs are studied in the pediatric population. And I can attest to, we need drugs in the pediatric population. Usually it takes, when everything's done, still 6 to 9 months for companies to kind of put all these documents together. It's thousands and thousands of pages of documents. And then the FDA gets 12 months to review it. If at the end of the 12 months, the drug gets approved, it gets what's called like a package insert or a label, right? So the FDA puts out the label, and that's kind of the instructions, right? This is what the drug is approved for. This is who it's intended to use. These are the recommended doses we go after. Granted, a physician could still, in theory, prescribe the drug however they see fit, but this is kind of what the FDA wants. Even after a drug is approved, companies need to still monitor safety indefinitely, right? So we do what's called post-marketing. So once it's on the market, companies still need to look for, are there adverse events, collect these adverse events. If you as an individual can report them, a doctor can report them, because there's sometimes times, unfortunately, for drugs where it may be tested in 1,000 people, then it's approved, and then it's approved and goes into hundreds of thousands or millions of people. And maybe you see something that just, it's rare, and you wouldn't have seen it with 1,000 people, but you see it with 10,000 or 100,000. So that's why companies need to continue to monitor this over time. So it's a really long process, and it's really regulated very strongly to ensure that the FDA approves drugs that they think are effective, drugs that they think are safe. But there's a very set structure one needs to follow to get there. And so that, hopefully that was a helpful roadmap to how we get a drug approved. I know I'll take now any questions. And again, a special thanks to the Ravitz Family Foundation for sponsoring this talk.
There is one question in the Q&A that I'll toss out to you here. It says, with the time horizon and high costs associated with trialing new drugs, can you speak to any efforts on drug repurposing initiatives for already approved FDA drugs in order to try to treat celiac disease?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. So the answer is yes. We do think there are drugs out there that could work for celiac disease. And I know we at Beyond Celiac are trying to talk to as many companies as possible that have a drug that may work in celiac to test that. Because you're exactly right. If a drug is already approved, it's already gone through a lot of the things I talked about in terms of like the non-clinical work in animals, the interaction studies, the heart studies, all of that. And it is possible you can just go right to a phase 2 or even a phase 3 study and completely shorten your timelines. And so there is potential out there. I know we are trying to, convince as many companies out there who maybe have a drug already in, in immunology or rheumatology or, inflammatory bowel disease that could work in celiac disease. Sometimes there are challenges where, at the end of the day, as we all know, sometimes a payer will determine, who can get the drug, who doesn't get the drug. And so, companies do have to make decisions based on, do we want to go in celiac disease? Do we not want to go in celiac disease? And so, we do think there is potential out there. And I know we continue to talk to pharmaceutical companies who have drugs that, we think we could work for celiac disease. So that absolutely could lead to a quicker route to having a drug for celiac disease.
Another question, why is it so difficult to qualify for clinical trials? I qualified for a trial that had local testing site, and they did not accept the blood work and biopsy at stage 3C Marsh score as sufficient evidence.
Yeah, so that's another really good question. And so I think it starts from where clinical trials they're following a protocol. And so we all know, and if you've looked into participating, right, generally for celiac disease, you have to have some documentation of having celiac disease with a genetic test, usually prior, histology. You have to be on a gluten-free diet. And depending on the study, and I can't speak to all of them, it depends on, some of them, usually if you provide that verification, that's sufficient. But unfortunately, with clinical trials, there's also repetition, right? So sometimes it's just the company, we may say, hey, listen, that was a while. We need to reconfirm that you have X or Y, or even though you have this blood work there, we need to repeat it there. But they should at least offer you to repeat it if it's blood work, if it's something like that. But oftentimes that just is the protocol of the trial. Sometimes companies may say, we need to see this again at the site now, as opposed to historic evidence that you bring in to qualify for a trial. But it just depends. Sometimes that's sufficient and other times it's not.
Another question we get this fairly often, and I'm sure you do as well. Why are there not more testing sites that are, more make it in theory, that would make it easier for more people to participate, right? Like more people could be closer to a location if there were more sites.
Another really good question. And so, when you think about how many patients are going to be in a trial, that usually determines kind of how many sites you have. So if it's going to be, a 500-person trial, you're probably going to need like 100 different sites. And oftentimes it's done in the US, it's done in Canada, it's done in Europe, it's done in Australia, because there aren't that many sites to start. And depending on, what disease you're going after. So for celiac disease, one of the things with, adults with celiac disease and gastroenterologists, there's not as close a follow-up in general. And so sometimes some of these sites aren't doing research or aren't doing research or aren't seeing celiac disease patients enough. And so that's why, although there are good sites, right, there are still a lot of good sites in the US, we need to continue to build sites and help them understand sites. Because although sites may see a lot of patients for Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, for celiac disease, they may not be able to conduct clinical research, right? So they may be really, really good at patient care, but to participate in clinical trials, they need to have the research staff, right? So you need study coordinators who can help with all the visits, who can help enter the data in all the database. You need a certain space and pharmacies and things like that. And so that's why, although there's really, really good clinical sites, both in big universities, outside of big universities, some of them just don't have the criteria to go into research. Then also when we're picking sites for a clinical trial, you also don't sometimes, it's hard to get new sites up and running, right? Because sometimes the new sites just aren't used to doing it or whatnot. You want your data to be kind of as experienced and as good as possible. And so all those things lead to kind of not as many sites, but I know we continue to try to work on developing more sites, having more sites, because again, for many, many other indications, there's sites everywhere across the United States. And so we see why, celiac disease shouldn't be the same, right? Everyone does endoscopies probably almost everywhere. And if we needed to do endoscopies, that's not a limitation. A lot of it's just from, the capabilities to conduct clinical research.
Thank you for that. One last question I want to ask, and this is something I'm not sure if everyone watching this would know or is aware of it yet, but we have this Beyond Celiac Investments program that we're rolling out. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how that and why that is important as a part of when we're talking about clinical trials, kind of to set us up for maybe our next discussions here, but around clinical trials. But I think, we're talking about BCI and people are hearing that, but I don't know that we all have a good understanding about how that fits in with what you're talking about today, that they do fit together.
Sure. Yes. So in essence, even to take a step back with it's Beyond Celiac, our goal is to help clinical trials and help recruit for clinical trials. And, obviously Dr. Deb Silberg, our, CSO, outstanding gastroenterologist, immunologist, and her team, again, all day, every day, working on clinical trials, working on science, working on, putting out more materials for celiac. So that's, first and foremost at Beyond Celiac, we're really helping with clinical trials, helping with research, and helping with education. On the flip side, as you mentioned, in February, we started something called Beyond Celiac Investments, where we actually, with some of the money we raise, we're trying to actually invest in some of these pharmaceutical companies that are early stage that really don't have investment. And as part of that is we're trying to get, really be a catalyst to really get excitement and to put more research into celiac disease. Because right now it really is one of conditions that's not funded very well, right? I mean, we know it affects 1.5% or so of the population. There's no approved treatments, yet there's not nearly as much money as we'd like going into celiac. When I said maybe 1 of 8, and maybe even be lower, 1 of 10 drugs is going to get to the finish line, we need 20 or 30 drugs to start to get more than 1 to the finish line and not just 1. So with Beyond Celiac Investments, our goal is to help bring more companies forward, because there's really, really interesting molecules and science and companies out there that are really trying to solve this problem. But unfortunately, they're not getting the millions of dollars they need early on to even get through the animal testing or through the phase 1 of development. So that's what Beyond Celiac Investments is doing. It's trying to help kind of catalyze investment, increase investment into celiac disease. So we do have many more drugs going into clinical trials, and then we can help recruit for those clinical trials and get more data and hopefully get, more than 1 drug approved.
Thanks. I kind of sprung that on you, so I appreciate you hopping in with that. I think that wraps us up for today, unless you have any other closing things you would like to share before we wrap up.
Just thank you everyone for attending. I think, again, it's such an exciting time. We have so much hope, so much promise. Again, clinical trials, we need research participation to get these drugs to the finish line. And I know there's a lot of information today. Please, feel free to reach out, and we can answer questions if they come up later to help people make decisions on clinical research, clinical trials, why to do it, why not to do it. But many thanks for listening today.
Yep. Thank you, Jordan. Bye.